It's my great pleasure to welcome Dr. Rebecca Erbelding. And she is a historian of American responses to the Holocaust and the author of the book she's going to be speaking about tonight, An Authoritative History of the War Refugee Board, Rescue Board, The Untold Story of America's Efforts to Save the Jews of Europe, which is available for sale, and Dr. Erbelding will be happy to sign your copy after the program. This book is the winner of the 2018 National Jewish Book Award for writing based on archival material. That's quite prestigious, by the way. She's a historian, archivist, and a curator at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington. So she came up here today from DC to be with us. And she's presented on U.S. immigration policy during the 1930s. That includes Holocaust-era diaries, Anne Frank and the Hucker album, a photograph album owned by Carl Hucker, am I saying that correctly?
Yes.
The final adjuncting to the commandant of Auschwitz-Birkenau. I'm reading her thing. She earned a PhD, I don't have a PhD. She earned a PhD in American history at George Mason University, and her research focused on ways in which communities deal with historical incidents of widespread and unexpected destruction, violence, and death. She's interested in the ways in which people, acting without the hindsight of history, react to outbreaks of such kinds, and try to protect themselves and their loved ones, and what pieces of their lives they fight to retain and rebuild. And though most of her work focuses on the Holocaust, which is the ultimate example of that kind of upheaval, she's also interested in epidemic disease, criminal activity, and natural disasters. She presents frequently on the War Refugee Board and the wide range of American responses to the Holocaust and other Holocaust-related issues. And despite all this, she claims to be a very happy person, which I think is wonderful to maintain optimism in times of such darkness. And with that, please join me in welcoming Dr. Rebecca Erbelding.
Every time I hear my bio read out loud, I think I should shorten it, so I apologize. I'm going to hold the microphone because I want to make sure that as I turn and kind of point at things that you can continuously hear me. I think it's really fitting that we started tonight with a commemoration of liberation, because liberation is the ultimate American and Allied effort to save the Jews of Europe. The United States, don't get me wrong, did not go to war to save Jews. It did not go to war to rescue Jews. It did not go to war for any reasons that have anything to do with the Holocaust. But the thing that stopped the Holocaust was the defeat of Nazi Germany, was the liberation of the concentration camps and Allied victory over Nazi Germany. And the efforts made by American soldiers, there were 16 million Americans, more than a tenth of the U.S. population, served in uniform during World War II, and more than 416,000 American soldiers died in the war. 50,000 just in Europe in 3 months in the summer of 1944, as Frank was coming up as part of the Fourth Army. And so honoring their efforts, I think, is a really fitting way to include in a Holocaust commemoration. So my book, Rescue Board, really begins the first full weekend of 1942 in the Les Milles internment camp in southern France. This is Roswell McClelland on the right. He and his wife Marjorie are in southern France as aid workers for the American Friends Service Committee, the Quakers. The Quakers had a really interesting relationship with Nazi Germany because they were pacifists, and because so many American relief organizations, particularly the Quakers, did a massive amount of relief after World War I. Germany is devastated after World War I, and so the Quakers are in Germany doing feeding programs, feeding millions of German children every year. And so the Nazis remembered many of them being fed by the Quakers as children. And so they allowed the American Quakers much more leeway to continue to distribute relief in Europe, even after Pearl Harbor and the US joined the war. So you have a situation in 1942 where you have a Quaker aid worker in Les Milles, which is a camp in southern France, and he's watching the first wave of deportations of foreign Jews from Les Milles north to Drancy, which is a camp outside of Paris, and from there they'll be sent to Auschwitz, where almost all of them will be killed on arrival. And Ross McClelland, our Quaker aid worker, knows what is about to happen to these people. About a week earlier, he had managed to get a meeting with Pierre Laval, who was the head of Nazi collaborating Vichy France, the southern part of France that wasn't occupied by Germany. And he had told Laval that Laval needed to stop these deportations, that France could not let this go forward, that he needed to tell the Germans that the Nazis planned to exterminate these people. And that's the words he uses in his notes in 1942. And Laval had laughed at him. He said, it's a fiction, it's rumor. The Nazis promised that these are special ethnic reservations in Poland where people will be well cared for. And anyway, Laval tells McClelland, if the United States, if your country cares so much about the fate of the Jews, why haven't you taken them? So Rescue Board then goes back and says, well, okay, how did we get to there? Or how did we get to there? And, we get to there because in the 1920s, we have new immigration laws that are specifically based in eugenic and racist science. The idea that some people are better biologically than other people, and that where you were born dictates what kind of person you're going to become. So there are countries that produce criminals and countries that produce good, upstanding immigrants. And our immigration law is based in that idea. So from the 1920s until the mid-1960s, we actually have laws in place that limit the number of immigrants from each country, giving far greater ability to come to people from Germany or from Great Britain, places where the good immigrants are, and far fewer slots for people from Southern and Eastern Europe, where Slavs and Catholics and Jews in particular live. So these immigration laws are structured since the 1920s, and there's really no appetite in the United States in the 1930s to change them, even as more and more information starts coming out about Nazi persecution of German Jews. This is not secret in the United States. Often when I talk to groups, they think that the United States knew nothing about what was happening to Jews until it was too late. This is not true. In the spring of 1933, within 6 weeks of Hitler being appointed Chancellor of Germany, Americans very much know it is headline news, even as Roosevelt is being inaugurated, even as the New Deal is beginning, even as Prohibition is ending. Often the headline is what's happening to the Jews in Germany. Jews being kicked out of the civil service, books being burned, Jewish stores being boycotted. This is a petition from March 25th, 1933. So this is 3 weeks into the Roosevelt administration, less than 2 months since Adolf Hitler has taken power. And the taxi cab industry of the city of New York is writing to the US government to protest. They're among the 500 plus organizations from all over the United States who write to the State Department or write to the government and send some sort of petition saying, we think you should do something about this. Reports have reached us that there exists in Germany a spirit of religious bigotry and racial hatred which has led to attacks and outrages on the Jews of that country, resulting in death, and that the German government has taken no steps to safeguard the lives and property of Jews. They're threatening to return to the anti-Semitic spirit of the Middle Ages, and we, the representatives of the taxicab industry of the city of New York, look to you in the name of humanity and religious freedom and human brotherhood to try to do something to stop this. They call it terrorism. But, as with most things, foreign things especially, Americans don't have a long attention span. And this slips off the front pages. Americans are experiencing 25% of our workforce is unemployed in the summer of 1933. And Americans, though they're protesting for a few months, they stop paying attention. They pay attention again with Kristallnacht, with the attacks on Jews in November 1938, which again is headline news throughout the country. This is the New York Daily News for November 11th. Nazi mobs burn and loot. This is the next day. Jews rushed to camps. But this doesn't result in any sort of sustained effort to try to help them. Hundreds of thousands of Jews are trying to get to the United States desperately. We make no effort to change our immigration laws. There's no asylum. We don't have anything like asylum in our immigration or in our government structure. You can't come as a refugee. That is a meaningless term in US law. And so you have all of these hundreds of thousands of people that we would classify as refugees, and we're trying to treat them like they're immigrants and have them come through this very slow and deliberate immigration process that is not set up for a kind of emergency like this. And there's enough anti-Semitism and anti-immigration sentiment in the US that even before Kristallnacht, a group of Jewish congressmen got together in the spring of April 1938, and they vowed amongst themselves that none of them are going to introduce any new immigration legislation, that the issue is so toxic among the American people that if they raise the debate, it will only result in a lowering of the number of people who can come. There's nobody thinks that the American people are willing to raise it. And this plays out. You see this again after Kristallnacht. There are two polls done by Gallup in November 1938, right after the attacks. And you can see that 94% of Americans disapprove of the Nazi treatment of Jews in Germany. But then when they're asked, same group of people, should we allow a larger number of Jewish exiles from Germany to come to the US to live, 72% of them say no. So it's this gap between disapproval and the willingness to be part of the solution that goes over this entire period. But as I said, hundreds of thousands of people are still trying to make it to the United States. Even after Pearl Harbor, there are still Jews in southern France, in Casablanca, in Lisbon, who are desperately trying to get out. And so the story becomes one of trying to figure out why were there still American aid workers working in concentration camps? What did they know? And how did the US then start to deal with this crisis? Too little and too late, but this crisis. But mainly, the story that I'm going to tell you is about what happens next. Because Roswell McClelland is not the only person working that first full weekend of August 1942. Gerhard Rigner, who was the representative of the World Jewish Congress in Switzerland, has just learned third hand, he's in Switzerland, from a German businessman that the Nazis have a plan. That all of these deportations that people are hearing about, all of these towns that are being wiped out in the East, it's all part of a plan to round up and murder all of the Jews of Europe. This seems really obvious to us now because we know the end of the story. We see what Frank, it's not DeStefano, I'm sorry, Labella. Frank Labella is your great uncle. Sorry, Joe? Labella? Okay, thank you. Sorry. We see just now what he saw at Ohrdruf, and that's kind of what we imagine in our brains. But for people living through that time, they've not seen this. They don't have images of concentration camps in their heads. And the idea for them that the Nazis are going to divert resources from a war that they're trying to win to murder innocent people did not seem logical to most Americans. They think it's a war rumor. They think it's just propaganda. They think it's the Soviets and the Polish government in exile trying to drum up support for the war by talking about how the enemy is killing women and children. And so it takes a really uncomfortably long time for the American people to understand that this is what's happening. And this is the beginning of it. Rigner gets this information. He writes a report to Stephen Wise, the most famous rabbi in America. And he thinks Wise is the head of Rigner's organization. Wise knows President Roosevelt. He figures if Wise knows what is going to happen, if I tell him, he will go to the president, and between the two of them, they will know what to do. And you can see that the message he sends is very frank, but very alarming. Alarming report in Führer's headquarters, plan discussed and under consideration all Jews in countries occupied or controlled by Germany, number 3.5 to 4 million, should after deportation and concentration in the East, at one blow exterminated to resolve once and for all Jewish question in Europe. So Gerhard Rigner sends this message through the State Department for delivery to Stephen Wise, and the State Department refuses to deliver it. They say it's just a war rumor, it's too fantastical to be true. And anyway, one of them says, even if it's true, there's nothing the United States can do about it. But this kind of information can't be kept secret for long. It's true, and it gets out anyway. And by the end of November 1942, Wise has confirmed it to the press. And that month, though, November 1942, is the same month that the Allies land in North Africa. They are thousands of miles away from the killing centers where most people are being murdered. So the United States, the Soviets, the British, and other nations in exile decide there's nothing we can do about this except to win the war. And so they issue a statement, they condemn the policy of cold-blooded extermination, And they promised that after the war, we're going to have war crimes trials. We're not going to try to attempt any sort of separate rescue, but we will have war crimes trials after the war. We will punish the perpetrators. And as time passes, as 1943 passes, more and more information is coming out. It's now been confirmed by the US government that it's happening. And there's more and more pressure put on the government by the American people to do something about it. There are marches and rallies in cities across the country with people, activists, pressuring their local leaders to do something. They're not quite sure what, but something to try to help Jews and other Nazi victims. There's an Orthodox Rabbis March on Washington in October 1943, where about 400 Orthodox rabbis march on the US Capitol demanding some sort of rescue response. At this point, mass rescue is impossible. We are thousands of miles away from the killing centers. There's no mechanism in which we can go in and scoop up Jews that are imprisoned in Nazi-occupied Poland. But this is a lost year. This is a year in which the United States understands that the Holocaust is happening and does not try to do anything to disrupt it. At this point in the story, a group of Treasury Department lawyers enter the picture, very unlikely heroes. They have spent the fall of 1943, as all of this is going on, getting increasingly concerned about the State Department. The State Department, which has been delaying humanitarian aid to Europe. And the Treasury Department is trying to figure out why. The Treasury Department controls economic sanctions over Europe and is willing to let humanitarian aid go through. Why isn't the State Department? So one Treasury Department lawyer in December 1943 sneaks into the State Department file room on a Saturday morning and discovers that not only has the State Department been deliberately delaying humanitarian aid, but that the Assistant Secretary of State, Breckinridge Long, had personally instructed US diplomats in Switzerland to stop sending information about the Holocaust to the United States. That information was trickling out to the activists, and if the activists don't know what's happening, they won't put pressure on the US government to do anything about it. So one of the best things about studying the Treasury Department during this time is that Henry Morgenthau Jr. is FDR's Treasury Secretary. He was from Fishkill, right near Hyde Park. They had known each other for years, he and the president. He's not an economist by any stretch of the imagination, but Morgenthau is a really good manager, and he trusts his people, and he's also a fantastic record keeper. You can go online now and you can read transcripts of almost all of his phone calls and almost all of his meetings for the 11 years in which he's Treasury Secretary. Every piece of paper that crosses his desk, he kept. And so, at the end of 1943, there's a meeting in his office about this. And Josiah Du Bois, who is the lawyer who snuck into the Treasury Department, or the State Department, says at this meeting, "Mr. Secretary, the only question we have in our mind, I think, is the bull has to be taken by the horns in dealing with this Jewish issue and get this thing out of the State Department in some agency's hands that's willing to deal with it frontally. For instance, take the complaint, what are we going to do with the Jews? We let them die because we don't know what to do with them." And then Randolph Paul, who is the Treasury Department's general counsel, says, "We're speaking as citizens now." And I always found that incredibly powerful, this idea that they're not coming to their boss with a policy proposal. They're not coming because they think it's going to play well with the American people. They're coming because they are citizens in a democracy, and they think that their country is better than what the State Department is doing. And so armed with the evidence that they've collected, they go to the president. On January 16th, they prepare a memo detailing everything that they've done. The original title of this memo is Personal Report to the President on the Acquiescence of this Government in the Murder of the Jews. And it begins, "One of the greatest crimes in history, the slaughter of the Jewish people in Europe, is continuing unabated. Unless remedial steps of a drastic nature are taken and taken immediately, I am certain that no effective action will be taken by this government to prevent the complete extermination of the Jews in German-controlled Europe, and that this government will have to share for all time responsibility." And so they decide to go to Roosevelt. On January 16th, 1944, Morgenthau and two members of his staff meet with the president, and they convince him to issue an executive order establishing a War Refugee Board, a new government agency tasked with carrying out a new U.S. policy of rescue and relief of Jews and other persecuted minorities. They can do anything they want as long as they do not interfere with the war effort. They cannot do anything that supposedly will delay the war. That is their only impediment. It's officially headed by the Secretaries of War, State, and Treasury, but is almost entirely a Treasury Department operation. It is housed at the Treasury Department. Treasury Department officials are the leaders of this organization, including the new director, 35-year-old John Paley, who was born in Omaha, went to Yale, and ended up at the Treasury Department specifically because he wanted to work on the New Deal. And he moves over to head the new War Refugee Board, having been in charge of U.S. economic sanctions and controlling the equivalent of $132 billion worth of controlled Nazi goods. So it is a very real job that he is leaving to take the very real job of trying to rescue Jews in the final year of the war. And by the time the war ends, 17 months later, the War Refugee Board has saved tens of thousands of lives. So at this point, most people, if I'm having a conversation with them, will say, how can this be true? I've never heard of this. And one of the reasons is that my book is the first one about them, which I always thought was funny because there are thousands of books that come out about the Holocaust every year and hundreds about the United States and Roosevelt. And so I just kind of assumed that someone would write faster than I do. But I think part of the reason is that a lot of the scholarship on American response to the Holocaust was done in the 1970s and 1980s, and you can see the arguments that these authors are making just from the titles of the books. The Failure to Rescue, While 6 Million Died. The most famous is The Abandonment of the Jews, David Weinand's seminal 1984 book, which is an amazing book, but it was 1984, it was 36 years ago at this point. And a lot of these books argue this story of an unbroken narrative arc of American anti-Semitism and indifference. The United States knew nothing and did nothing, or it knew everything and did nothing. But either way, they would have been too anti-Semitic and indifferent to do anything had they known. And often these books, including The Abandonment of the Jews, have a section at the end that's, oh, but there was this War Refugee Board, but it was too little and too late. And Wyman says it was too little, too late, and it saved 200,000 lives. And that was what piqued my interest initially, because that's a disparity. It's too little and too late, but it also saved 200,000 people, Wyman says. That is kind of incredible. And so I really wanted to look into who these people were and what they did and what they knew and how they made the decisions that they did. And then as soon as I dug into it a little bit, I realized the other reason why nobody had really done anything about this. And it's because of the records of the board itself. They are up at the FDR Library in Hyde Park. There's about 120 boxes of written material in two main series, a correspondence series and a projects and documents series, both about 60 boxes. It is basically in the order that the secretary decided that day in 1944 when she went to file it. So if there was a letter about me coming to Wagner College to give a talk for the anniversary, it could be under Wagner College in the correspondence series, W for Wagner. It could be under E for my last name in the correspondence series. It could be under the projects and documents series of like collaboration between CSI and Wagner. It could be really anywhere in 120 boxes. It's whatever the secretary just decided that day. So the few historians who have written about this had just taken a few boxes from the project series and then used it to kind of summarize the whole story and not really gotten into the rest of it. And when you do that, when you just summarize this little bit of the story by looking at the folders marked Turkey and not in everything, you only get that tiny part of the story, whatever they decided that day. And you also lose chronology. You're telling the story of Turkey, not the story of 1944. Chronology is incredibly important when you're looking at stuff like this because it matters when you're talking about rescue whether the Nazis have invaded Hungary or not. It matters whether we've landed on D-Day or not, as to the type of rescue that you can do, as to the prisoners that you have access to, as to the leverage that you have over the Nazis who are now certain to lose. And so I realized very early on that I was going to have to photograph all 120 boxes and put it in order. That I was not going to be able to look at it this way. So I spent 2 years photographing the entirety of the War Refugee Board collection and a few hundred, dozens of other collections, hundreds of documents from the Treasury Department records and the State Department records and personal collections from families whose loved ones worked for the board. And I assigned each document, which I printed into a PDF from the images that I took with my camera, with an elaborate title. So this one is 440621 WRB R08 F11 D179, which that title on a PDF means that it's a document that was created on 1944, June the 21st, and that I found it in War Refugee Board Reel 8, Folder 11, the 179th document on the reel. And when you do this with what turned out to be 43,000 PDFs, and you put them all in one folder and you hold your breath, they sort chronologically. So no matter what collection I got it from, where in the country, it's sorted chronologically from the time that it was created. So then I could go through and read in the order that the War Refugee Board received documents, in the order that they wrote them, what information they had and when, how are they making decisions and why. This is a piece of my database, but I can see the image of the document. I can put in a title and a key and the author. I can put in keywords, and I can take notes, all of which is searchable. And so I really could answer some really definitive questions that historians have had for a long time that was just hidden in a document in a folder that you wouldn't have looked at. But when you put it all in order, you realize that the secretaries were actually hiding things and not meaning to. So let's talk a little bit about what the War Refugee Board was and did. How did they do these things? The very first thing that the War Refugee Board does, actually the day that they're created, is they streamlined the process that refugee aid organizations like the JDC, like HIAS, could use to send humanitarian aid to Europe. They first decided that if some of that aid falls into the hands of the Nazis, it's not a big deal. We're still gonna win the war. If some of it gets to people who need it, that's what we want. So by the end of the war, they've authorized the equivalent today of $154 million in humanitarian aid from a whole host of different aid groups. And this goes to buy guns for the French underground. It goes to buy food for children in hiding. It's used to create false papers so that Jews can live as Christians or as Allied citizens, and to pay off border guards who are helping people escape from Nazi territory into areas of safety. The board appoints representatives in most of the neutral countries in Europe, in Switzerland, in Portugal, in Sweden, in Turkey. They have somebody in London, they eventually have somebody in North Africa. And those people are there basically to put pressure on the neutral governments. The neutral countries, like Switzerland, have been playing at both sides for the entire war, trading with the Nazis, also trading with us. And now it's become clear that the Allies are going to win. And so the Americans start putting pressure on these governments to do more to help us, to protest what the Nazis are doing, to allow more Jews over their borders, to pass on intelligence about what they're seeing inside Nazi territory to help the War Refugee Board. So from Washington, John Paley, who's on the right here, lays out his strategy. He and the board are going to try to convince the Nazis and their collaborators to stop the killing, and then they're going to try to rescue the people who are still alive. They're either going to move people on the margins of Nazi territory, in places like Romania, Bulgaria, and France, into areas of safety, or for people deep inside Nazi territory, in Poland, in Hungary, in Germany, they're going to try to keep them alive as long as possible, alive long enough to be liberated. So I will give you a quick example of each one. The first thing that the War Refugee Board does is it issues warnings to the Nazis and their collaborators. The very first propaganda campaign they have sends radio broadcasts into Nazi territory. They drop leaflets from Allied airplanes. And in March 1944, they actually get Roosevelt to issue one of the statements in his words. They write it, of course, but it's in his words. And it is pretty stark. In one of the blackest crimes of all history, begun by the Nazis in the day of peace and multiplied by them 100 times in time of war, the wholesale systematic murder of the Jews of Europe goes on unabated every hour. So March 1944 is really a pivotal point in the history of the Holocaust, because the Nazis have just invaded Hungary. They invaded about a week before Roosevelt's statement, and Hungary was the largest and last mostly intact Jewish population in Europe. There are about 800,000 Hungarian Jews, or Jews in Hungary, 600,000 Hungarian Jews, 200,000 Jews who had escaped to safety, what they thought was safety in Hungary. And so when the Nazis crossed the border in March and immediately begin rounding up Hungarian Jews, the War Refugee Board panics and really starts trying to focus on trying to rescue the Jews of Hungary. They add a paragraph to Roosevelt's statement. As a result of the events of the last few days, hundreds of thousands of Jews who, while living under persecution, have at least found a haven from death in Hungary, are now threatened with annihilation. That these innocent people who have already survived a decade of Hitler's fury should perish on the very eve of triumph would be a major tragedy. I mean, it's basically aimed at would-be Hungarian perpetrators, saying you haven't been a war criminal yet. Why would you start now? It's really hard to measure the effects of psychological warfare. You can't say these people survived because this atrocity was prevented. But this is a copy of the statement as it came out from Roosevelt. This was dropped from an Allied airplane over Germany and Hungary in the spring of 1944. And I found this because I was interviewing an elderly German man who remembers receiving it. He found it in a potato field in April 1944. And Allied propaganda was really smart. So you see Roosevelt's statement on one side. On the other side would be reports of local bombing raids. So the Allies would say, we just hit this factory in the town near yours. And so you on the ground know that's true because you witnessed the aftermath of it. And so the guy that I interviewed said that's how I learned about the Holocaust, is I knew that the rest of it was true, and so I assumed that this was true as well. The U.S. government, through the War Refugee Board, also laundered money to help refugees sneak into Sweden. I've given versions of this talk, or of a talk, at the Treasury Department a couple of times now. They love this story, of course, because they are the heroes of this story. And the last time that I did it, it was a public lecture, and they asked me if just for this time could I not call it money laundering. and I said, well, it was, and they said, yes, we know, but we don't want the headline. Can you call it secret money transfers? And so I agreed to call it secret money transfers, which to me means the same thing, but I guess to the Treasury Department, they like that headline better. Anyway, this is Ivor Olsen. Ivor Olsen is the Treasury Department financial attaché attached to the Stockholm legation, which sounds like a very boring job, except that he's an OSS spy. Precursor to the CIA, he is codenamed Crispin and is in charge of monitoring the movement of money and war material between Sweden and Nazi Germany. So when he takes on the job as the War Refugee Board's representative, it's actually his third full-time job. He has his cover job, his spy job, and now his humanitarian aid job. And among other things, he is the guy who selects Raoul Wallenberg, the now famous Swedish businessman who goes to Hungary in the summer of 1944 to try to rescue Hungarian Jews. Remember how I said that the US was putting pressure on neutral countries to do more? One of the things that they do after the Nazis invade Hungary is they go to all of these neutral countries and they ask them if they will increase their diplomatic representation in Hungary, send more people there, spread them throughout the country to either act as deterrents to violence or as witnesses to what's happening. And only Sweden says yes, for a variety of reasons. Only Sweden says yes, and Sweden says, who do you want to send? And the War Refugee Board picks Raoul Wallenberg, who works in the same office building as Ivor Olsen. That's not the money laundering story. So for much of the summer of 1944, Olsen is focused on trying to get refugees out of Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia by water. He needs $50,000 to buy speedboats and guns, which he will then give to partisan groups, to underground groups operating out of Sweden, who have bases on the islands off the coast of Sweden and want to use these speedboats and guns to land on the beaches in Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia and bring people back. So he says that he will need the most skillfully organized type of underground operations because the Baltic countries are sealed to everything, but if he can get $50,000, they think, these underground groups think they can get 600 or 700 people out of each country. The War Refugee Board pays for this directly out of funds from President Roosevelt, but they're very nervous about the Swedish government finding out that we are funding unregulated refugee entry into a friendly nation. And Olsen reports that Swedish Jews don't want to know either, that Swedish Jews are this is a quote, let me find it, very interested in Jewish rescue and relief operations as long as they don't involve bringing refugees to Sweden. So they need to sneak the money in. John Paley in Washington contacts the staff at Goodyear Tire in Akron, Ohio, and asks if the US government puts $50,000 on the books of their factory in Akron, will their factory in Norrköping, Sweden remit $50,000 worth of Swedish kroner to their man Ivar Olsen, which is how they do it. There's no record of this in any of the 120 boxes that I looked at of the War Refugee Board records. They scrubbed them. There's a record on the financial ledger and nothing else. But among other things that Henry Morgenthau kept, along with all of the transcripts of his meetings, he had folders of their incoming and outgoing correspondence, and they forgot to scrub his records. So this is from 1944, from June. This arrangement worked well, and although not foolproof, it's desirable from a security point of view. At this time, we don't recommend bank transfers, as receipt of cable transfers of such size by individuals involved in operations unavoidably attract notice and suspicion. So he divvies up the $50,000 among 3 partisan groups. They buy their speedboats and their guns, and they get 4,000 people out of Lithuania and Latvia and Estonia. Most of them probably escaping the Soviets as well as escaping the Nazis. Very few of them, if any, Jewish. In Switzerland, the War Refugee Board needs to find somebody who's already there. Switzerland is entirely surrounded by enemy territory, so when they need an American representative, they need to find someone who is already in the country. In the fall of 1942, after watching the deportations from southern France, Roswell McClellan slipped over the border with his pregnant wife, planning to wait out the war in neutral Switzerland as a Quaker aid worker. And so he is in place when the War Refugee Board needs an American and gets recruited to be the new representative. By this point, he's 30 years old. He is in charge of all of the underground operations going in and out of Switzerland, of which there are many. And among other things, he participates in ransom negotiations with the Nazis. The Nazis are looking around the same landscape as everybody else, realizing that the Allies are likely going to win. And so some Nazis decide, well, maybe we can get something for the Jews if the US cares about the fate of the Jews. So McClellan and Sally Meyer, who is the Joint's representative in Switzerland, managed to string along a group of high-ranking Nazis for 7 months, claiming that the US is interested in paying ransom for Jews and that we will do it, we just need to cross a couple of T's and dot a couple of I's. At the beginning of November 1944, McClellan even goes to Zurich, to one of the hotels in the big banking district, and has a personal meeting with SS Obersturmbannführer Kurt Becker, who works directly for Adolf Eichmann. And McClellan pretends that he is President Roosevelt's personal emissary, sent by the president to express his personal interest in the fate of the Jews. So during the war, a US government humanitarian aid operative meets with a high-ranking SS officer in uniform to discuss ransom for humanitarian purposes. And as a result of these meetings, McClellan and Sally Meyer get more than 1,600 Jews out of Bergen-Belsen as a good faith gesture on the part of the Nazis for carrying this on. Beyond all of this, the War Refugee Board opens a refugee camp in upstate New York in Oswego. They bring about 1,000 mostly Jewish refugees to live there. This is the only group of refugees we bring outside of our immigration laws in anything akin to any sort of refugee or asylum. They are kept there for more than a year, about a year and a half, behind barbed wire. So even though they are here, even though they are brought to America, they have come and they are forced to live behind barbed wire. But the US does this because they argue that we can't be hypocrites. We can't be asking other countries to take more refugees and then visibly not be willing to take our own. The US, the War Refugee Board, sends 300,000 packages, food packages, into concentration camps in the final weeks of the war. So if you've ever heard a survivor give testimony about getting a food package in a camp, It was almost certainly packed on Long Island, shipped across the ocean to Sweden, disguised as a Red Cross package, and delivered in the final weeks of the war to Dachau, where this photo was taken, to Mauthausen, to Ravensbrück, to Sachsenhausen, never with anybody understanding that this was paid for or created by the US government. They pass on requests from the War Department, or to the War Department, to bomb the gas chambers and the rail lines and the crematoria leading to Auschwitz. That is rejected by the War Department, who says that would be a diversion of war resources, which is the one thing the War Refugee Board is told they can't do. And so in the fall of 1944, when the War Refugee Board receives this report, which is a report written by 2 escapees from Auschwitz, they title it German Extermination Camps Auschwitz and Birkenau. It's a very graphic report that gives names and dates and populations and very graphic details about the process of arrival and selection and gassing at Auschwitz. The War Refugee Board sends this to the War Department and says, we think you need to bomb. And the War Department writes back and says, no, it's still not a priority. And so the War Refugee Board gives this to the press. They send this out to 200 newspapers nationwide. It's front page news, Thanksgiving weekend, November 1944. This is the Louisville Courier, which you can see has tried to cram the entire text onto a full-length page for its readers. And a week after this report comes out and is nationwide news, the Washington Post writes an editorial called Genocide. It's the first time this word is ever used in an American newspaper, and it's used with the argument that the War Refugee Board has just introduced Americans to a new crime and that we need to learn this word now. So, in conclusion, the War Refugee Board's creation was and remains really the only time we ever tried to do this, the only time the US government creates a new agency and tasks it with trying to save the lives of the victims of our wartime enemy. In contrast to a lot of different subsequent human rights efforts and efforts related to refugees, it's not about the Cold War, it's not about intelligence. The people that we're trying to help generally have no idea that the US has any interest in their survival. Most still don't. The refugees in peril are not intended to become American citizens. Most Americans still don't want more immigrants, even after the war. But the War Refugee Board, according to historian Yehuda Bauer, who is historian emeritus at Yad Vashem, he wrote, what made the War Refugee Board such a unique body is that it was officially permitted to break practically every important law of a nation at war in the name of outraged humanity. And so one of my goals with this talk, and I hope you'll help me with it, is for the War Refugee Board to start to enter our public narrative about the Holocaust. Because I think it is a really relevant story. A lot of what they're trying to do, decide between trying to provide relief for a lot of people or rescue a few, bring refugees into a country when there are very real national security concerns, debate how many resources we can risk falling into the hands of our enemies. These are things that we keep debating today, and sometimes we debate them as if it's the first time. And there are precedents we can go back to, and people who are devoted to trying to save refugees and trying to help refugees with all of these things in their heads. And so I want to both honor their efforts, because these were incredible men and women doing amazing things and dedicating themselves to trying to help Jewish refugees. It doesn't take back the many, many years in which the United States could and should have been doing much more. But it does show that after a lot of activism, after a lot of pressure, there was an official government response, and it was a response to try to help. And I think that is something that we can remember, to honor them and to remember as we study what they did, as we continue to confront similar challenges today. Thank you very much. We have about 10 minutes. 10 minutes for questions. If anybody has any, just raise your hand and I will repeat the question. Yes, sir, in the orange sweater. Yeah. Yeah, the question is, what did Great Britain try to do? I think Great Britain does a much better job than we do in 1938 and 1939 with the Kinder transports. You know, we we talk about having our own transport of children. There's a bill proposed by Robert Wagner here in New York, and Edith Rogers, a Republican from Massachusetts, so a Republican and a Democrat, bipartisan bill to bring 20,000 German refugee children to the U.S. in 1939 and 1940, and it doesn't even make it out of committee. There's no movement on this. Most people don't think it will succeed. 67% of Americans want it to fail anyway. So they do a much better job before the war begins for immigration, but they really have to generally shut their doors in 1939 when they get involved in the war. We continue immigration for longer than that. And then during the war, they seriously consider bombing for a while in 1944, but then decide that the Americans are in a better place to do it, and the Americans, of course, drop the ball on that. They don't have anything akin to a War Refugee Board, though. They, with their proximity to Europe, I think they see the war in a very different way than America does. Yes, sir, in the back.
Two things I want to add up. First of all, one ship from Germany, they said Louis, I think, came to the shore of America, they turned them back and sent them back to the death. That's one thing I want to mention. And second, there is a book called Buried by the Times,
Yes.
in New York Times.
Yeah.
They knew very early about what's going on.
Yeah.
And that could change the whole situation, but that's what it says. They buried the news, let's say, in the 19 pages, the 19th page, and that's 2 paragraphs in the bottom of the page.
Yeah.
They knew all about it, and they did everything not to let the public to know about it.
Well, I can address both of these. So, because they're both a little bit more complicated than the kind of sound bites that I think a lot of us know about history. The first thing is that the St. Louis is actually the only ship that's ever turned back from the United States. Between 1938 and 1941, there are about 111,000 self-identified Jewish refugees who come to the U.S. as immigrants. The Holocaust Museum estimates that somewhere between 180 and 220,000 refugees, again, refugees coming as immigrants, find haven in the U.S., which is much less than 6 million, to be sure. The St. Louis is actually aiming at Cuba. The passengers don't have U.S. immigration visas, and so they're in line for immigration to the U.S., many of them, and they're planning to wait in safety in Cuba. Cuba turns them away because they had purchased their paperwork from a corrupt Cuban official who the State Department estimated had made $1 million off Jewish refugees, selling these false papers to them. And so the Cuban government turns them away. The U.S. government does not accept them. They think that it would be jumping the line. It would be setting a precedent where there are people waiting back in Germany who could come. Canada, likewise, does not offer them asylum. The joint gets involved and manages to negotiate with the governments of France, Belgium, the Netherlands, and just the 3, to divvy up the passengers so that none of them have to go back to Nazi Germany. At the time, this is June 1939, that's considered a success. The passengers throw a party on board. They're thrilled that they won't have to go back to Europe or to Nazi Germany. The joint even makes a fundraising video about what a great job they did, that they quickly scrap as soon as the Nazis invade Western Europe the next year, and some of the passengers are once again under Nazi occupation. No, I'm sorry. This is Great Britain, the Netherlands, Belgium, and France. I gotta give them all credit. They divvy up the passengers. 2/3 of the passengers, more than 2/3 of the passengers survive the war. In terms of Buried by the Times, there are quite a lot of reports about what's going on. Most Americans are not reading the New York Times. I think there is a valid criticism of the Times for not highlighting this. I think they fall into the same trap that a lot of people do of saying this could potentially be propaganda. And if it's not going to be on page 1, it's going to be on page 19 with the other foreign news that's unverified. We don't have reporters in Eastern Europe who are verifying what's happening. And so I think the Times acted with an abundance of caution that, given the seriousness of the situation, was probably unwarranted. But most Americans are not reading the New York Times. It depends on what their local paper decided to do. Some of them are trumpeting it. The Jewish press is obviously much more tuned in. to what's going on. And so the Jewish community, especially the ones who could read the Yiddish newspapers, could read the foreword, they know right away what's happening, and they know the whole time. And they can't get anybody to listen. Yes, in the hat.
Can you tell us a little bit about, in spring of 77, I was to Reagan's Western against on.
I'm sorry, I can't hear you.
Then I went to Poland for a week. Can you tell us a little bit difference between Auschwitz and Birkenau?
Oh, sure. Yeah. So Auschwitz-Birkenau is really three main camps. There's Auschwitz I, which is the first camp that was created. It's largely a forced labor camp for men. Birkenau was built a little bit later. That's where the gas chambers and the crematoria were located, and also a women's camp, a family camp. The camp for Roma was located at Birkenau. And then there's Buna-Monowitz, which is a few miles away, and that is another forced labor facility that is making synthetic rubber and synthetic oil for IG Farben. And so there are three distinct parts of Auschwitz, but they're all together. So Auschwitz is both an extermination camp, a concentration camp, and a labor camp, all built into one, which is why so many people, in part, why so many people went through there. Yes, sir.
You're questioning the U.S. involvement in trying to get neutral countries to take Jews. I was wondering how much U.S. efforts to prevent Jews from reaching Palestine got in the way that specifically
The white paper.
everyone knows about the St. Louis,
Yeah.
but there's also the case of the Bruma, which
Yes.
was a
The Struma. Yeah.
a ship of Romanian Jews that had permission to get to the Holy Land, but under British and American pressure, the Turkish government refused access to the Bosphorus, and eventually someone actually sunk the ship.
Yes.
How much efforts of the Rescue Board trying to get a neutral country to take Jews got in the way of State Department efforts warning these
Yeah. It's a
not
really
to
good
assist
question.
Jews to get to the Holy Land?
It's a really good question. So the U.S. for most of the war is very hesitant to push the British on Palestine. The British control Palestine as part of the British Mandate, what is now the State of Israel. And so the Struma comes about when this group of Jews board, they get to Istanbul, they're not permitted to land in Turkey, they spend a month sitting off the shores in Istanbul. Finally, they're towed back out to sea, and without a motor, they're towed into the Black Sea and sunk by a Soviet submarine. That is December, I think it's December 1942. It could be 1941, I apologize for not remembering. So the U.S. Officially, of course, thinks Palestine is a really good idea. There are bills in Congress that are passed in the spring of 1944 while the War Refugee Board is getting up and running, specifically expressing that the U.S. thinks that this is a haven for Jews and wants to put pressure on the British to do it. Roosevelt is hesitant to put pressure on the British to open up Palestine, and officially the white paper is set to expire in March 1944, which was the date after which there was to be no Jewish emigration into Palestine anymore. The War Refugee Board kind of gets around that. They convince the government of Turkey to allow about 8,000 passengers to land in Istanbul. They go by train across Syria and into Palestine. So the War Refugee Board's representative in Turkey, along with the U.S. diplomatic corps in Turkey, are really instrumental in getting the British to agree to this, and all of the diplomatic machinations that are involved in getting people across all of these areas, buying the boat, getting Romania and Bulgaria to let them out, getting the Turks to let them in, getting the French to let them go through Syria, getting the British to let them in, getting the Jewish agency to issue the papers. It is a massive diplomatic effort. Not always successful, but in this case they get about 8,000 out in the summer and fall of 1944. There are more questions, but I think we're going to conclude the program. I will be out there signing books if anyone is interested to pick one up. Thank you so much.